Alright, what's poppin', people? We're back, and today I had a little fun video idea that I wanted to go over with y'all. And it's going to involve me trying to decide what Pokemon is the GOAT of NU. Now, what am I meaning by that? Well, what I want to look at is a Pokemon from each past gen of NU, including Sword and Shield, since we're getting Scarlet and Violet NU within a week or so. And I wanted to just look over what I consider to be the best Pokemon from each of these past gens, look at it within the confines of its own generation, and then kind of compare it to how it's defining its format of NU relative to all of the other options and see, okay, who ends up being at the top? If we had to say what Pokemon defined NU, ran NU, whatever verb you want to use, more than any other one. And as you can see for our list, we've got Glalie representing ADV NU. This should be DPP here. We got Skuntank representing DPP NU, Garbodor for Black and White, Mesprit for Oras, Incineroar for Sun and Moon, and then of course Rotom-Mow for Sword and Shield. Now, if you do enjoy content like this, make sure to leave a like and tell me in the comments below, because I like feedback, and I want to know what the people watching the content enjoy, so hey, let me know. But of course, to give a brief rundown of each Pokemon, let's start with Glalie. So, Glalie is in a generation of NU that is very, very, very Spike-centric, and it is the best Spiker, and it's not really particularly close. So I went with the offensive Glalie set here just to demonstrate what I'm considering Glalie's best set, but admittedly, even the specially defensive set is really good too, so just to show how that compares real quick, you change Earthquake to Protect, because it's very useful for scouting, explosions, stalling out low power point moves like, say, Hydro Pump from a Wailord, etc. And this sort of set is also really useful for checking, again, foes like Wailord, foes like Haunter. Generally, just ADV is a very special attacking, like, wall breaker-centric tier. All of the best wall breakers, basically, bar like Flareon and CB Hitmonchan, are special attackers. And so, unlike Glalie, which is very funny to see take this defensive role given it's an ice type, it actually ends up being one of the best, just general mons in the tier. And it's how it solidified its spot over the competition, because if you look at Roselia and Cacturne, well, other than, like, say, Pikachu, Glalie ends up checking the same list of Pokemon to a still very effective degree, because sure, it doesn't resist water, so it's not checking, it's not taking Wailord's Hydro Pump as well as they are, but it's not weak to ice. It can very easily fit Protect on its set in comparison to those two, which maybe struggle a little bit more doing it. And then add on, the fact Glalie is really fast. In general, it's just super versatile between what sets it can do, what moves it can run on those sets. Because the moves you're not seeing here are like, Icy Wind. You're not seeing Torment even. You're not seeing Toxic. You're not seeing even, like, Light Screen as a way to make foes like Torkoal and Flareon less effective at beating Glalie. This is, without a doubt, the best Pokemon in that format. I don't think it's arguable, and so it's our selection. And then in DPP, we've got Skuntank, and this was a Pokemon that I actually did kind of struggle with deciding on if it was the GOAT for DPP for me, because I do think both Regirock and Slowking have a good argument to be had as well. But if you think about what Skuntank does for DPP, if you just want to have a brief gander at the VR for DPP NU, look at all of the Pokemon that it is helping keep in check in this tier. You're able to threaten Pursuit Traps on Slowking, you help keep Drifblim, Jinx, Gardevoir, Haunter, all of those in check. You help even contain Pokemon like Shiftry and Vileplume just because of your defensive typing. It's a very useful Pokemon. It's got one of the strongest forms of priority in the tier as well. And there are a decent amount of, like, annoying fast Pokemon that being able to snipe out with a Sucker Punch is really useful. Think about those like maybe Charizard, Choice Scarf, Manectric, or even like Specs or Life Orb Manectric Tauros, though. Pursuit also is just really valuable in this sort of format, I feel. Because we're also looking at... You're not looking at a tier that is as Spike-centric as ADV for sure, because you actually have multiple forms of removal, so they're not just as present anyway. But you still do have a very hazard-centric focus tier. So you've got, you know, if you're looking at just the top Pokemon, you see Regirock as a hazard center, Cacturne, Credilli, Nidoqueen, Sandslash. And so having a Pokemon that's able to, like, really get some extra punishment done to switches when they happen, I think is pretty good. Now, of course, Garbodor was the only Pokemon ever in contention for Black and White, and everyone that's ever played the tier knows why. There are not Rapid Spinners in this tier. There's not one viable one. Wartortle is not real, and Garbodor is the best spike setter by a country mile, because also look at what it's doing defensively. What other Pokemon do you check? You also end up with a check to Serperior, kind of a check to Kangaskhan. You take 1,000,000 from its attacks, but you still force a ton of chip damage on it if it's double edging. You've got a check to Sawk and Primeape as well, which is super necessary. A check to Skuntank, Girder. I mean, this Pokemon not only is a great form of spikes, but it also is keeping in check a ton of the common wall breakers, and that, much like Glalie, just puts it heads and shoulders above everything else. I also think something that is worth noting with Garbodor is that, wow, I had a comment to make there and I completely forgot it, and I just still tried segueing into the thought, hoping it'd come back to me. Oh, goodness, where is the thought? It was such a good comment, too. It was about spikes. Oh, I remember it now. Thank you. So, think about why spikes are so valuable in this tier 2 beyond that there aren't really good forms of removal. Look at one of the top Pokemon in the tier. And this kind of extends to injury hazards in general if you want to take into account Mandibuzz and Charizard as well, for the Stealth Rock side of things. But being able to negate Alamomola's Regenerator almost entirely if you get 3 layers is just super, super duper crucial. And yeah, I mean, it goes without saying that, okay, well, yeah, spikes not really being able to be removed. I mean, that just kind of makes them generally good anyway. But I think when you also look at shutting down the best defensive Pokemon in the tier a little bit, or even getting a little closer to shutting it down, I think that's just really, really worth emphasizing. And next up, we get the Mesprit for Oras. Now, we're looking at Choice Scarf. Or not Choice Scarf, we're looking at Choice Specs Mesprit, because it's just an absurdly good wall breaker in this tier. I mean, you're looking at the common steel types in this tier. Well, there really aren't many. You've got Steelix, which isn't known for its special bulk, so it's not taking repetitive psychics very well. And otherwise, I mean, you know, where's our steel types? Ferroseed? The Pokemon completely blocked by Xatu? Okay. And then you keep scrolling and you're like all the way down here to Aggron by that point. So a lot of the times, what teams have to do is they have to try really hard to pivot around that Psychic. Try and get Dark types in, like Shiftry, like Skuntank in versus Mesprit. And this kind of does showcase again why Skuntank's so good in some of these tiers. You know, give a shout out to Liepard too, because both Liepard and Skuntank can also threaten that Pursuit Trap. So Mesprit forces teams to often play very aggressively versus it to try and prevent it from just, you know, freely using its strongest attack 6 times a game and just picking 6 Pokemon to KO. And then again, this tier isn't as bad about removal and general hazard prevention as other tiers, because you've still got Xatu, you've got good Defog finally, so Skuntank is relevant as a remover, you've got Hitmonchan as a potential spinner, and there are some other defoggers as well that I'm just neglecting to mention, like Pelipper. But spikes are still really prevalent because, I mean, hey, look at our good friend Garbodor once again at the top. So spikes are really common. Ferroseed as well can get them up. And so having your wall breaker not really care about chip damage in general is super valuable. And next up we get to Incineroar for Gen 7 and U. And Incineroar is just very, 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 very strong. I mean, it's not a Pokemon that necessarily checks the entire tier or anything like some of these other Pokemon do, namely Garbodor and Glalie. But SD Incineroar is just that perfect blend of both offense and defense, making great use of these super strong pinch berries from back then. And that gives it a lot of leverage in a game, because you never really have to dedicate to setting up. And your raw bulk supplemented by Intimidate is, frankly, just enough to end up letting you go into your offenses, invest fully there, instead of worrying too much about your defensive stats. And of course, when you do choose to Sword Stance up, Incineroar's checks defensively aren't exactly, you know, super plentiful. Because when you look at a lot of them, you're looking at, say, maybe Guzzlord, which gets sniped by Superpower. Opposing Incineroar, which gets sniped by Superpower. You're looking at maybe Stoiz, which doesn't really take +2 knockoff very well, if it still has its item on it. You're looking at Passimian, maybe trying to pivot in on your knockoff. Aerodactyl, you're just hoping you come in on, like, the turn at Sword Stances. Or maybe for your Z move, you could also come in on a knockoff. Obviously, you're not switching into a boost Incineroar, though. You know, another Pokemon like Seismitoad hates knockoff as well when it's boosted. Rhydon in general hates knockoff. It's just a Pokemon that's so easy to get mileage out of. And although I don't think it's as just, you know, it's not a hard mod to justify not using, maybe, when you look at, like, Glalie and Garbodor in comparison. But it offers so much to a team that I think oftentimes it is really easy to just, when you're team building in SM, just, you know, you're looking at the Pokemon you want to build around, maybe you find a little defensive core to attack on, and then you can find yourself really just almost automatically say to yourself, okay, then I'm going to add an Incineroar here, and I'm going to opt for this set, just because it does so much. Between having knockoff, between soft checking a ton of other Pokemon in the tier, you know, gives you that Dark Resist, that Ghost Resist, which are both super, super useful in Gen 7. And it gives you enough, too, on the offensive end, where it's not like you're just risking building yourself into a super passive team because you opted to put an Incineroar on it. You know, it's not like you're doing the same with, say, maybe using a Steelix or a Blastoise. And then, of course, last, we've got Rotom Mow for this generation, and I think it's pretty obvious as to why. Everyone seems to believe that this Pokemon is at least a cut above the others. Even if it's maybe not got the Giga Gap potential for, like, oh, I can never build a team without Rotom Mow. You know, it's like, you can certainly do that, but Rotom Mow is just one of those Pokemon, I think I view it in the same vein as Incineroar, where you can just be building your team and you're like, okay, here's my Wall Breaker, here's my setup sweeper that likes what the Wall Breaker does, and then I like this Stealth Rock setter because it fits well kind of defensively, maybe even can force damage as well onto a Pokemon for my setup sweeper, and then here's my Rotom Mow because I need, you know, let's list off all the things this mod's gonna do for us. Choice Scarfer, so it's a fast mod, so it's a Revenge Killer too, and it's a ground immunity, and it's a water resist, so it can pivot in on certain attacks, and it can, you know, help against bulkier teams too with Trick, and it's a pivot. You see, it just does so much. And think about it too, this is only us looking at Scarf. This sort of idea also applies to Mesprit, where these Pokemon, Rotom Mow is not nearly as versatile as Mesprit, but Rotom Mow does still do so much in terms of set versatility too, between just, you know, maybe changing this move on Scarf. You know, you could see Nasty Plot here, you could see Pain Split here, because the idea is you're going to get the Scarf off of you eventually. So you may as well have a move designed for use once you've gotten rid of your Choice Scarf. And now you could have Will-O-Wisp here. You could even just have Thunderbolt if you want a more spammable electric attack. And in sets that aren't, you know, Scarf, I mean, you could just see straight up Nasty Plot. You could see some of these like bulkier sets that maybe say max HP, max speed, just so you do get a little bit more defensive use, because, I mean, 107 in both defenses is really good. So it can help it take a few attacks from, say, Pokemon like maybe Rhydon a bit better. A lot of options with these Pokemon, that's why they're all S-rank. And it's why they're all, at least to me, considered the best for the generation. And of course, just a brief disclaimer here, I didn't include GSC and RBY because they're still kind of underplayed, I think, overall. RBY less so. The issue with RBY is teams generally are comprised of the same 4 or 5 Pokemon, and in whatever, like, filler you want to use. So for an RBY NU team, you can almost always assume a Charizard, a Blastoise, a Mr. Mime, a Clefable, and in generally a Venomoth as well. So trying to decide what the best is from that is sort of like deciding what your favorite food is out of a list of your favorite foods. You're going to include all of them, and you're going to get really annoyed when you can't come to a good conclusion because you like them all so much. Now, if we're going to try to start figuring out what the GOAT of NU is, I think the easiest thing first to do is get rid of Pokemon that aren't really the GOAT of their own generation without some questions being asked. And so what do I mean by that? Well, Skuntank I'm going to put an X by for DPP. Because if you're looking at the DPP VR like we just did, I mean, what, it's not even the sole S rank. You know, S rank has a total of 5 Pokemon in it, and even the S sub ranks got Regirock and Slowking too. And I kind of went over this when we were talking about Skuntank anyway, but I think there's a case for Regirock to be the best mon from DPP. Because, much like Skuntank, it does an awful lot defensively for a team. You're looking at a Pokemon that just stat checks so many different wall breakers, and also, I mean, resist their attacks. So you're looking at, it's a check to Skuntank, Zard, Tauros, whereas the next ones it's checking as well. Oh, here we go, Magmortar, Typhlosion. It does an awful lot for you defensively, and it's on dang near every team, even more offensive teams. Because, I mean, you could still invest in its attack, you could run, like, Custat Berry sets on it. You could even just see, like, Lumberry Lead designed to make sure you always get your rocks up and didn't get Explode versus something else. And then we can talk about Slowking, which, funnily enough, was actually my original pick for this. You can look at Slowking, and you can say, okay, well, I've got another mon that defensively answers so many of the potent offensive attackers. I've got another Pokemon that is really versatile too, and can set up with Nasty Block, can run these disgusting block trapper sets too, take advantage of opposing Slowking, set up to +6 versus them, and then win the game on a spot. And for those reasons, I just don't think Skuntank is definitively enough the best in its own generation to warrant saying that it's going to be the best Inyor of all time. And that's kind of going to be the same issue for Mesprit too. Because while Mesprit is undeniably a super stupidly potent attacker with versatility that rivals that of even like Glalie, for example, I do still feel that Oras is a tier where it's like not as top heavy as you'd imagine it to be. Because you've got, this is black and white, you've got a lot of Pokemon just within these upper ranks that you really can count on seeing every couple of battles multiple times. Again, we could do the thing where we look at S rank and go, oh, well, here's a whole bunch of other Pokemon here, but it extends beyond that. It's not like Mesprit just defines the tier entirely around it. I think you could argue, in fact, that it's more Xatu that does that. Nowadays, you see Vileplume even forcing increased Mesprit usage just so you actually can deal with Plume defensively, because it runs these obnoxious double recovery movesets that make it infinitely more difficult to take down. And so it sort of suffers the same fate that Skuntank does, where it's like, yeah, I think this Pokemon's still the best. I just feel like there's so many other Pokemon in the tier is so diverse that I'm not really feeling strapped if I don't use a Mesprit on a team. I think its power is undeniable. But is it so much better than these other guys to where I feel the need that I need to use Mesprit or else I'm just putting myself at a disadvantage? No. And that's kind of where we also fall with Incineroar, where I think Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, Inyu is so diverse that you aren't really forced into Incineroar spam every game. Is this Pokemon super effective every time you use it? Of course. I mean, it's got Stab Knockoff. It's got Intimidate. It's got a really weirdly good defensive typing. I mean, if we're looking at what you're checking defensively in this tier, you've got a check to Sigilif, kind of a check to Comfey. It's not like a good one, but it is a check. A Delphox check, a Dhelmise check, even kind of a Sceptile check, a Whimsicott check. I mean, make no mistake, Incineroar is doing a lot on both ends of it. But I mean, you can make teams without Incineroar really, really easily. And they're not any worse than a team with Incineroar. I mean, if you just want to look at, if you just want to even compare like other Pokemon of a similar typing, Delphox teams are super great. Guzzlord teams are fine. You know, even teams like Goro or Sneasel, you could, of course, stack Dark type super easily, but if you wanted to say, you know, this is my Dark type, and I will fill in Incineroar's defensive roles with a Pokemon like, say, you know, Steelix could pick up the slack on some of them. Slowking, it could pick up the slack versus some of them. Again, go back to Guzzlord. It checks an awful lot of the same stuff as Incineroar. Maybe do a little bit less of an little less effectively, but it still does it. And so I just don't think Incineroar is falling into the same category that maybe like Glalie and Garbodor do. Or like Rotom-Mow even to some extent does. Because I feel like these three Pokemon, when you get to them, you really are getting to that point where you're like to ask yourself, man, is it not worth throwing this onto my team every game? These three just feel a cut above the rest. And so as a result, we're going to call these our finalists. Glalie, Garbodor, and Rotom-Mow. And so, in third place, we have Rotom-Mow. Now, why is Rotom-Mow going to be a notch below Glalie and Garbodor for me? I feel at the end of the day, Rotom-Mow defines what Sword and Shield NU is. Without question. Because it is, like I was saying earlier, it's actively hard to justify building without Rotom-Mow. Because of what Choice Scarf gives to your team. Because of how its interactions work versus all the Volt blockers too. The mere existence of sets that aren't Choice Scarf Rotom, and how viable those sets end up being too, makes it really hard to play around it. Because until you know whether it's Choice Scarf or not, you can't really confirm to yourself what the right way of playing around it is. Because obviously you're always going to want to Volt block versus it. And if they're not Choice Scarf Rotom-Mow, the Rotom-Mow is going to Volt Switch every time versus your ground type, and they will Leaf Storm you once you think that you are safe. You have to do so much playing around it that it's really, really annoying in practice to feel safe against the spawn. And so teams often give just constant momentum through the whole game, and they just kind of hope that eventually you can absorb the trick with something that doesn't mind it too much, and then at least start offensively threatening the guy. The one reason I do feel it's at least a notch below Garbodor or Glalie is that I still don't feel pressed to use Rotom-Mow on every team. I think there exists just enough versatility outside of Rotom-Mow with other slots to where I think you can get away without it. Compare it to, say, like Glalie and ADV, where I can't really think of a team that I would never use Glalie on. Same with Garbodor Black and White. Except for maybe Hyper Offense, you could justify a Garbodor on basically every structure. I feel like Rotom-Mow is just ever so slightly below them, because if I'm using Hyper Offense, I'm not running a Rotom-Mow. If I'm running, like, Stall, I'm not running a Rotom-Mow. And at the end of the day, too, it's not like Rotom-Mow is the only option for what it does in our tier. It offers the roll compression beyond anything we've really ever seen, I think, in NU. But it still feels replaceable at times. I could still run another electric type. I could still run another grass type even. I could run another Fastmon. I could run another Scarfer. And although I think Rotom-Mow makes it infinitely easier to just say, okay, but just run me, these last two do define their own forms of NU a little bit more in my eyes than Rotom-Mow does. And so, who's our GOAT? Well, it's hard to say for me. Because you're looking at two metagames where spikes merely existing cause these two to have so much more inflated viability than they otherwise would. I think if I'm pressed, I'm gonna say that Garbodor is the best Pokemon ever, for NU. And you could even say this extends beyond Black and White for Garbodor, where we've seen this Pokemon be hyper viable for a span of what? 8 years, maybe longer? Because Garbodor wasn't just great in Black and White. It wasn't just great through ORAS. It was great through Sun and Moon as well. And so if you're going to talk about the greatest Pokemon to ever grace our tier, I think you have to say Garbodor. Because not only did it define an entire generation through its mere access to the move Spikes, among other things it does, it kept being the best Pokemon at what it did. For years upon years upon years. It had nearly a decade of dominance. I mean, we're talking Landorus Therian equivalent in some ways, where this Pokemon, it was just so good at what it did. And of course, yes, you could say, oh, but Garbodor wasn't the literal defining factor of ORAS NU or SMNU. I think SMNU, there's a little more of an argument there as well, by the way. Garbodor with Toxic Spikes certainly has a case for being one of the defining factors there, but I digress for now. not only do you have it being the king of an entire generation, it even extends a little bit beyond that. And with Glalie, yes, Glalie is by far the king of ADV. I think you might even be able to say Glalie is the king of ADV to a greater extent than Garbodor is the king of Black and White. Because at least with Black and White, right, you've got a whole bunch of other Pokemon that are frankly kind of overtuned for their setting. I think you can say Alomomola, Mandibuzz, both a little ridiculous as well to exist in this tier. Whereas with Glalie, it feels a step above even what's in S rank. Where the difference comes down to me here ends up being Garbodor, it may have contemporaries that match it from Black and White. You're still not dropping Garbodor. Just because spikes are so prevalent. At least in DPP, for example, where you're talking about, again, this mon is super good. And, okay, Regirock and Slowking are also super good and on almost every team. You still have teams that can drop them, and you don't feel super bad about it. Dropping Garbodor in Black and White is like cutting off your left hand and saying, it's fine, I have my right hand still. Like, you're not wrong, but why would you do that? What is wrong with you? That's where I think the distinction still does come from Garbodor with a couple of these other mons. Where, okay, yes, they also exist in a tier with multiple other S ranks, so what's the big deal? You know, Garbodor does it too. But yeah, well, Garbodor is still just defining its own format to such a greater extent because not using it does really feel like you're crippling yourself. And so yeah, TLDR, Garbodor is the GOAT of NU. It defines its own generation of NU like none other, and not only does it do that, but that same level of dominance maybe doesn't translate across other generations, but it keeps it highly relevant. We're talking top 10 mon status throughout nearly an entire decade. And that's why I believe that it is the best mon that NU has ever had when you think of NU Pokemon. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this video. This is a really fun one to think of and make. Like I said earlier, if you did, leave a like, comment what you had, what you enjoyed about this. I'll catch you next time. Peace.